So without doubt, corporal punishment, and by that I mean the use of violence in the name of discipline and the good care and upbringing of children, is without doubt a child protection issue. And you can see that just from these effects. Research has shown that the use of corporal punishment, even the so-called mild chastisement, can inflict direct and indirect physical harm. It can lead to poor mental health outcomes for children, increased risk of depression, anxiety, drug use, poor development, brain development, poorer educational outcomes, increased aggression and the use of antisocial behavior, increased support of and use of violence in peer relationships, adult perpetration of violence and criminal behavior, and the experience of intimate partner violence, sometimes as a victim as well as a perpetrator. And the cost of such violence to society is immense. There's been research which estimates the economic impact of this kind of violence across society can be huge, could amount to as much as $7 trillion worldwide. And this is a massive cost, and much higher than actually investing in the prevention of this form of violence. And this research shows that actually the costs are at every level. It's for the child, throughout their life, and for wider society. And it's for this reason that we must build in the prevention of corporal punishment into our child protection system and make every action we can to change society, to stop using this form of violence as discipline. The global initiative works across the world to see the elimination of corporal punishment, and this data shows how widespread a child protection issue it is. Data from across 62 countries has examined the experiences of children between the ages of 2 and 14 years at home, and it showed that 80% experienced some sort of violent discipline, whether it was physical or psychological aggression. 70% experienced psychological aggression, 60% experienced physical violence, and 17 experienced very severe physical punishment, such as hitting a child on the head repeatedly, which can lead to very, very severe developmental damage. Law reform is the essential first step in order to tackle corporal punishment as a child protection issue so that we can strengthen the systems that are there to protect children. Where we have the evidence, we can see that putting in place laws to prevent corporal punishment has had a very significant change in society in terms of attitudes and opinions about the use of corporal punishment. And it shows that passing that law to prohibit corporal punishment has sent a very clear message to society. You can see from this evidence, for example, that in Sweden, which was the first country to prohibit corporal punishment in 1979, when the legislation was passed in the 70s, half of children were regularly hit in the name of punishment. And this was reduced to a very, very few percent, 2 to 3% of society in the 2000s would ever report using physical violence in the name of discipline. In Finland, which followed with legislation in the 80s, we see the same change in attitudes towards corporal punishment. When the legislation was passed, 47% of adults thought that corporal punishment was an acceptable form of discipline. And this was reduced to 15% by 2014. In Germany, 30% of young people reported being thrashed in the 90s, which was reduced to only 3% by 2002. In New Zealand, the approval of corporal punishment was over 90% in 1981. And after legislation was passed in 2007, this approval rating was reduced to 40% by 2013. And Poland, which prohibited corporal punishment in 2010, approval rate of corporal punishment fell 18% in 5 years. There isn't enough research, there are just some examples I've given you, but we need to see more of this kind of research to show the impact of passing legislation to strengthen child protection in this way. The law clearly sends a message to the public that it's not acceptable to use violence to bring up children. And also, in terms of child protection, very importantly, it removes a barrier to protecting children because it will remove a defense for parents or the right to correction, which so often disguises other forms of child abuse going on in the home. Because of the importance of passing strong legislation to protect children, this is what the Global Initiative to End Corporal Punishment focuses on. We were formed in 2001 and launched in Geneva, and we support a very large movement of supporters, civil society, academics, health professionals, and government representatives worldwide who are all working towards passing legislation. We provide in-depth monitoring of legislation around the world in every setting, including in the schools and in the criminal justice system. We track progress and monitor the prevalence of corporal punishment, and we scan for opportunities to pass laws to strengthen child protection. Where governments are open, we will provide technical assistance and guidance on passing strong legislation. We provide training and guidance and face-to-face advice in as many languages as we can to support the process of putting in place strong laws to prohibit corporal punishment. Without doubt, though, worldwide, there is still strong resistance to the idea of passing laws to tell parents how to educate their children. And it shows how entrenched in society the use of violent punishment is, and that includes in Europe. There are many reasons for this. For many people, it's a deeply personal issue. Many parents have experienced it in their own childhood, and they were brought up to see it as a reasonable form of child rearing. It has become very normalized, and it seems to be an enormous task to tackle the sort of traditional or cultural or social acceptance of using violence to bring children up and to use violence as a form of discipline. And it makes it difficult for us to convey to people that it is actually an issue of equality and of human rights. It is placing children on an equal footing with adults in terms of their entitlement to rights. This is why it's so important that it is strongly integrated into child protection systems and that we pass laws to get across the point. And this applies in Europe as well. We do need to see strong laws that show that corporal punishment is not an acceptable form of child rearing and to strengthen the child protection systems to make sure that it is implemented. There are many areas in Europe where it is still seen as an acceptable form of child rearing, and also great resistance that we should pass laws that interfere with the private sphere, that interfere with the domestic setting and the parents' rights. But this is why, as the Global Initiative, we always would advise that the law reform is the first step, because it's about challenging these views and setting out a very clear framework, and that helps professionals give the right advice to parents about what is right and what is wrong. There are so many views that we hear very often around the world. They're very similar. People say corporal punishment didn't do me any harm. Parents have the right to bring up children as they see fit. There is a big difference between just a loving smack and beating a child. This is only a problem if it is extreme child abuse, and there are far worse violations. The prohibition of corporal punishment will just criminalize good parents and put children in care, and that we should educate parents rather than prohibiting it. These are common objections. We hear them frequently. We have, in fact, produced a set of booklets to try to give the answers to these objections. I have brought some copies today if people are interested in these frequently asked questions booklets, and they're available to download on our website. But to come to some of these objections, the question of why should we pass laws? Should we not just let attitudes change over time? Should we not be concerned about criminalizing parents? These are very significant and important objections that we should address. Firstly, what is important is to provide very clear legislation. Law reform should aim to prohibit all corporal punishment and all forms of cruel or degrading treatment, and reflect the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It must be clear in legislation that assault against a child cannot be justified. because one of the strongest objections to this is that one of the strongest problems in child protection is that there is often a defence of the use of corporal punishment in law. For example, in the UK, we have the defence of reasonable chastisement. So in a situation of assault or child abuse, the parent can rely on that defence to justify their actions, and this can then prevent the authorities taking the right steps to protect that child. And so in order to remove this defence, the law to prohibit corporal punishment should be comprehensive and clear. It must use clear and uncompromising language. Because corporal punishment is so often accepted as a form of child rearing, it's often not even seen as violence. The law must make it very clear that we are talking about corporal punishment and discipline. So a law which simply prevents all forms of violence against children is not explicit enough, because many people will not see the discipline that they mete out to a child as violence because it is normalised. And it's essential that the law is structured in a way so that it can be implemented in the child's best interest. This is essential. And it comes back to that objection that by passing laws we are just criminalising parents. It is essential that the law is structured in a way so that it can be carried out in the child's best interest. And often it's not in their best interest for the parent to be criminalised or for the child to be taken away from the family. In a case-by-case basis, as with any other form of child protection, the law must be carried out in the child's best interest. And so in many cases where we are talking about so-called mild punishment, the law is there to send a message and to be educational, to make it clear that it's not acceptable. And it's only in very severe cases where intervention such as removing the child should be necessary and should be good for that child. Just some details in terms of the way in which the law should be structured. For many people, the terms corporal punishment and physical punishment are interchangeable and they mean the same thing. The word corporal means body, so corporal punishment means any form of violence against the body, including mental violence. The global initiative, we always use corporal punishment. And again, I come back to the fact that this is so often normalised. If we talk about violent punishment, for many people they think, I don't use violent punishment. Not me, I don't use violent punishment. I'm just using your normal discipline. So this is why we use corporal punishment, because then we know exactly what we're talking about. We're talking of any form of violence against the child. We use as our starting point the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child and their definition of corporal punishment because it is very comprehensive. It means any punishment in which physical force is used and intended to cause some degree of pain or discomfort, however light, and that is very important, however light. It includes hitting with a hand or an implement, kicking, shaking, throwing, scratching, pinching, biting, pulling hair, boxing ears, forcing children to stay in uncomfortable positions, burning, scalding, or forced ingestion or force feeding. The convention is helpful because it is so comprehensive. It talks about all forms of violence that are cruel or degrading, so that includes mental violence, punishment which belittles, humiliates, denigrates, scapegoats, threatens, scares, or ridicules a child. In the view of the committee, all corporal punishment is invariably degrading. The convention is also helpful in that it sets out the range of settings in which legislation should be applied, and it should be universal. It should be anywhere that affects a child's life. So we should ensure that legislation protects children from all forms of violence. It should tackle traditional practices which incorporate corporal punishment as part of their beliefs. It should include the school setting and ensure that all treatment in school is done without violence, and should make sure that children in no way are subjected to any form of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. We refer in our work and our advice to the UN Committee's general comment on the right of the child to be free of corporal punishment. The general comments of the Convention are there to provide detailed additional information to really explain how the committee believe that the Convention should be implemented. And we rely on this for advice in terms of passing legislation that will be effective. That it should set out a clear obligation on the state to prohibit and eliminate all forms of corporal punishment, including in the home. And it sets out the guidance for achieving this. And this is important. The Convention is one of the most ratified conventions worldwide. There is only a few tiny, tiny minority of countries that have not signed up to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And so with that comes these obligations. And that is very helpful to us because there is still resistance, for example, in passing legislation that interferes with the parent's right in the home. And yet the Convention makes it very clear that we should do that to protect children. The committee has made 451 recommendations about this issue to 190 states, and it is consistent in the advice that it gives states when it examines them against the Convention, that legislation should be passed and efforts made to implement it fully in order to make sure that children are fully protected. As a consequence, there is really growing consensus that we should use law reform to protect children from corporal punishment and to strengthen our child protection systems. Not only has the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child done that, but so have other committees, and I would include in that the Human Rights Committee and the committee that follows the Convention Against Torture. They also consistently recommend to governments that they pass legislation. And the issue is very frequently raised in the Universal Periodic Review. So that is when states give advice to other states to improve their human rights record. My organisation, we routinely brief countries that have prohibited corporal punishment to make the recommendation to other countries that they should follow and do the same. And that is proving a very effective mechanism because it's giving advice between governments that they should all follow the same model. And what has been a really significant step forward is that now the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030 have been agreed. They were agreed in 2015. And they include the issue of corporal punishment. It is under goal number 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. Target 16.2 to end the abuse of children includes as an indicator of progress the percentage of children between 1 and 17 years old who have experienced any physical punishment and psychological aggression by caregivers in the past month. And this is a very significant achievement, and it has really pushed the realization of government that they should take strong action to pass legislation and protect children against what has always been seen as acceptable discipline and as acceptable caregiving. In addition, the Sustainable Development Goal number 4 on a quality education has also helped us. Target 4A, which is that we should build and upgrade education facilities so that they are child, disability and gender sensitive and provide safe, non-violent, inclusive and effective learning environments for all, has really helped our movement to fully prohibit corporal punishment because the violent punishment in the school context violates the child's right to education, but it also creates an intimidating environment, often makes children not want to go to school or they leave entirely, and it discourages them from learning and fulfilling their potential. And so we are seeing a growing movement of organisations that realise the necessity of tackling this issue as a child protection issue. You can see some of them here. Some partners to the No Punish project here today, such as Save the Children. And we can see how we are seeing progress worldwide. This is the rate of progress to see full law reform in all settings. So by that we mean in the home, in schools, in the criminal justice system. It was started in 1979 by Sweden. And we now, in 2018, have seen 54 countries worldwide fully prohibiting corporal punishment. And without doubt, you can see the speed and the increase more recently that has no doubt been encouraged by the development of the Sustainable Development Goals. We have hope that the number will increase very soon. We have draft legislation being considered in South Africa, in the Philippines, and in France. We hope that the number will increase in the new year, and we will continue to see progress. And you can see here the picture worldwide. It is the pale yellow countries that have fully prohibited corporal punishment in all settings. And you can see that it isn't a European issue, that actually progress is spread worldwide. It's the purple ones where we are most concerned about a lack of progress. And you can see that there are many places where you would expect to see better progress, where we still have to see legislation. I would include Canada and the United States, Australia, where we perhaps would have expected to see progress in putting in place the laws to protect children, and yet we haven't. So we'll move on to Europe now for us to consider. Again, you can see it is the yellow countries that have fully prohibited corporal punishment. All other states on this map have prohibited corporal punishment in the school setting and in the criminal justice setting. So there is some progress. But where we see the barrier to full progress in Europe is in passing legislation that it goes into the domestic setting, that starts to curtail the rights of the parent and protect the child. So we hope we may see a change in France. The legislation is being considered right now. And to clarify, in terms of Italy, in Italy, our Supreme Court did rule that corporal punishment is unlawful in all settings, and including in the home. And that legal decision stands. But for the global initiative, for us to classify a country as fully prohibiting, we would want to see positive legislation on the part of government where they express very clearly in law that corporal punishment is wrong and that it should not be tolerated, and that the care of children should be based upon respect and dignity, because that sends a very clear message. It shows the commitment of government to child protection, and it sends a clear message to society about how a child should be treated. And that is the step that we want to see before we classify a country as fully prohibited. So we can see in Europe, in the north, around the Baltic Sea, a cluster of states that have all passed those bills and have made it clear that in every setting that a child will experience, it is not acceptable to use violence. And it's in the Baltic Sea region that we have been able to examine what steps are needed after you have passed that very clear legislation. Because law reform alone is not enough. You can pass the law, you can send a very clear message, but then actually this law needs to be made a reality. And that requires a whole other set of strategies. So the benefit of having that group of states around the Baltic Sea, and also the union of the Council of Baltic Sea States, gave us the opportunity to see in detail about some of the challenges of making those laws a reality. And this was a project funded by the European Commission too, which enabled the Council of Baltic Sea States, with us as a partner, to look across this region, because 10 out of 11 of those states have fully prohibited. Over 2 years, the Nonviolent Childhood Project then was able to look at an example of 5 states in that region, and that included Estonia. I see we have a representation from Estonia today, which is great. Consultations were held in each of these 5 states to understand the challenges and the good practice and the barriers to fully implementing the law once the law had been put in place. And examine some of the real kind of strategies that will mean that law can be effective. And just for an example, it was very revealing to discuss with Sweden the challenges of the law, because as we come back to that graph, you will recall that Sweden was the very first nation to ever put in place this legislation, and it dates back to 1979. Their legislation actually took a zero tolerance approach, so that every single infraction against a child was automatically a crime. And so for them, it still remains a challenge. How do you balance an effective law that will really send a clear message and prevent violence against children and allow you to prosecute when prosecution is going to help the child? And it shows that our understanding of child protection is constantly evolving, because for them, the zero tolerance approach actually is perhaps not really working fully effectively as an educational and preventative method, because what we want really is that a parent feels that they can seek support when they need support, and they can get support and help if they're struggling in the family home, and that help will be there for them. A zero tolerance approach, actually, if every single infraction is automatically has to go to court, has to have a criminal response, it doesn't allow us to make sure that that protection and that support for parents is there. So it shows that we are constantly learning about the best way in which to design child protection systems, and the best way in which we can actually make sure that this type of law primarily acts as an educational and awareness-raising mechanism, and only criminalises a parent when it's going to be in the child's best interest. So from the Non-Violent Childhoods project in the Baltic Sea, we have agreed a set of broad principles to try to help us balance the educational versus the prosecution. We found that it is important to have explicit and clear prohibiting legislation, which I've already set out as the main mission of the Global Initiative. We need to have accompanying child protection systems that implement the law effectively, always in the child's best interest. We need to have it supported by a comprehensive national action plan for implementation that places the child at the centre, and primarily put services around the child so help can be accessed by parents or children early, that act in a preventive way, and that monitors the effectiveness of that legislation. We need to have adequate training and capacity building for all service providers on the front line, so they know how to recognise violence, they know when to offer support and intervention, and they know when to bring in the police or other intervention. We need to provide information across all of civil society so that everyone in society understands the purpose of the law and what the alternatives to violent discipline are. And awareness raising to promote this, to change attitudes. So the project in the Baltic Sea has condensed all of this learning into a set of 6 guidance documents which are available on the website, and which I would recommend, because I think it is the first time really that we have a full and comprehensive series of guidance which goes from passing a law through all the stages of implementation to make it effective and to help us balance that care and prevention against the prosecution of parents. The series comprises a step-by-step overview, which is a short guide to the whole process, a guide to implementing law in the domestic setting, so primarily governing the private care of children by parents, which is the most sensitive and the most challenging to enact and implement, a guidance on positive parenting and positive discipline, a guidance on communication and awareness raising, so that the law can primarily act in a preventative and educational mechanism, guidance for service providers on the front line to help them support the implementation of law, and finally guidance on tracking progress, which I think is of particular interest today, given we'll be hearing later today about the No Punish project and the mechanisms for gathering information and tracking progress on child protection. And as I say, on the website for the Children at Risk Unit at the Council of Baltic Sea States, you can see these guidance and download them for use. And so just in conclusion, the principles from the Global Initiative's perspective is that law reform is the essential first step, the essential foundation for eliminating corporal punishment, as it sends this clear message that we should be caring for children in a different way. But law reform alone does not eliminate corporal punishment. Law should be seen as a preventive and educational mechanism, and it should be communicated and promoted as such, supported by a strong child protection system that will enable early intervention when a family needs support or a child needs help, and put in place that support so that the child can be protected, and at all times that protection is enacted in its own best interest. So thank you very much.